Hi, everybody. I think we're just about ready to get started. If everyone wants to settle in, silence your phones, that kind of thing. Everybody who's presenting, your mics are at a good, you feel good about your mics, good distance from your bodies and all the rest of it. You have to kind of get used to speaking in front of a mic.
Check, 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 check. Yeah.
Testing.
Testing, check.
Yeah, I guess they're okay.
So, hello, audience. Thank you for coming to this inaugural event of the WGS event season. This is WGS Intersections at the Halsey. It's our kind of interdisciplinary salon that features WGS affiliated faculty from across campus in conversation about art as it's happening at the Halsey. And today we have the amazing opportunity to also welcome a curator from the International African American Museum to join into the conversation. Just to give you a bit of background into Intersections, so WGS Intersections was the brainchild of our previous director, Women and Gender Studies professor, Krista Weld. She started the series in 2021, and we've had the good fortune of continuing our partnership and really enjoying such a fruitful relationship with the Halsey and all of the beautiful things that they bring to campus. So, Chris, thank you for inventing this amazing occasion for us to talk about art. I'd like to begin by presenting our four speakers today, our four discussants. We have, to my right here, this is Martina Morale. She is, let me get to my biography page. Martina M. Morale is a public historian and museum professional with expertise in African American history, the African American experience, and the larger African diasporic experience. Martina has contributed to the reinterpretation of 2 Confederate monuments in Atlanta and served as a curator of a heritage tourism initiative in rural Georgia. For the past 5 years, Martina has been a valuable member of the curatorial and exhibitions team at the International African American Museum. Currently, she leads the team as director of curatorial and special exhibitions. We're so grateful and pleased and honored to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. On the far end is David Dulceany, and he is assistant professor of Hispanic studies at the College of Charleston. Some of his research and teaching interests include Latin American and Caribbean cultural studies, LGBTQ+ and gender studies, Latinx studies and comparative diasporas, Afro-diasporic religions, specifically Santeria and Voodoo, digital humanities, Black and Afro-descendant coastal communities and cultures. And the 3 faculty members we have with us today are all Halsey Fellows, which is a semi-new program, I believe, maybe in the past year, that links faculty members and their courses directly to the exhibits, and I think features a lot of coursework in the galleries themselves. And so his course is a first-year experience seminar entitled Freedom by Water, Black and Afro-Descendant Coastal Communities in the Americas. This semester, his class engages with Demond Melancon's exhibit, As Any Means Are Necessary, which is surrounding us here, to explore how Black coastal communities across the Americas share an enduring cultural legacy and ongoing fight for racial and environmental justice. Shout out to any of his students are here. Any of your students here? Raise your hand if you're here from Dr. Dulceany's course. Nice, okay. Don't mean to put you on the spot. Next to Dr. Dulceany is Dr. Kenneth L. Johnson II, who is Assistant Professor of African American Literature in the Department of English. His research interests include 20th and 21st century African American narratives, Black men's public letters, the work of Kiezi Layman, Black Southern boyhood, Black men's memoirs, and Black masculinity studies. His course, associated with the Halsey this semester, is a first-year experience learning community entitled Who Dat? New Orleans World Politics and Cultural Rhetoric. and it's paired with Introduction to World Politics, which I will present in a moment. This semester, Dr. Johnson's course centers on Demond Melancon's exhibit to discuss New Orleans Black mask-making beadwork as visual rhetoric and a genre of visual storytelling. So we'll come back to those themes in a few minutes. And finally, our last presenter is Dr. John Thomas III, Assistant Professor of Political Science. His research interests include comparative race politics, social movements, democratic consolidation, minority rights, and public policy with a regional focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. His course is, again, entitled Introduction to World Politics, and it's paired with Dr. Johnson's course. And so this semester, his class engages with the exhibit that we're looking at to examine issues of imperialism, indigeneity, and legacies of Black resistance. And so there were a lot of vocabulary words in all of those biographies, and if some of them are new words to you, we'll be unpacking most of them throughout the discussion today. I know it's a lot of, just a lot of terms that are good to know. So the way that we'll do our session today is I've prepared some questions to ask each of our presenters, but they can also be in conversation with each other if they would like to, and then we'll leave some time at the end for audience questions, so make sure if interesting things are coming up or you want to ask a follow-up about something, there'll be some time for that at the end. So I'd like to start with Martina Morale, who has such an interesting perspective on Demond Melancon's work. As Any Means Are Necessary is the title of this exhibition, but she's also played an instrumental role in bringing Melancon's work to Charleston in the first place. And she's also from the same place as Demond Melancon. And so I'm looking to you to orient us a little bit. So when you come into the exhibit, there's a big picture of Demond in a suit, in a masking costume suit, and it talks about him with his title as Big Chief of the Young Seminole Hunters. And he's presented in this exhibit as an art worker and a New Orleans culture bearer. And so I'm wondering if you could provide us some context with that, telling us a little bit about your growing up in New Orleans and the southern Louisiana area. Talk about some background on Demond, just to get us kind of oriented. His name sounds French to me, Demond Melancon. Any kind of context you could give us would be awesome.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. Yes, so thank you for having me. I am from Louisiana, Lafayette, Louisiana. So that is slightly further west in New Orleans. So you're going to go through New Orleans, through Baton Rouge, which is the capital, and on to Lafayette, Louisiana. So what that means for me is that a lot of the culture that I bear was isolated. If you think about Louisiana geographically, southwest Louisiana in particular, lots of waterways. So obviously the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, but the Atchafalaya Basin is what divided my mom's family, my mom's ancestors from my dad's ancestors, which meant that they almost had two different cultures. In fact, they almost broke up over whether or not rice was served for the first meal they had when my mom cooked. My dad said that they were from two different cultures because she did not make rice as a side dish. So if that gives you a context for Louisiana, it just, food is the first thing you think of. And of course, my parents are coming tomorrow and they will be bringing some food for me. So I'll tell you a little bit about Demond as I kind of talk about the tradition of Black masking in this context of Southwest Louisiana and culture bearing. So Demond is from the Ninth Ward of New Orleans, which of course was devastated by Hurricane Katrina, and so you might have heard the Ninth Ward referred to. My mom is also from the Ninth Ward, so a historically Black community in the city of New Orleans. Demond has been practicing Black masking since the 90s, so he was a young man, I believe in middle school when he started to kind of follow the tradition, look up to those who were practicing the tradition. Of course, Black masking is kind of a product of Mardi Gras, the tradition of the celebration before Lent. And so Black masking is part of that in that you're celebrating this kind of cultural heritage of both Mardi Gras, but also this mixing of cultures that happened in the Louisiana Bayou in particular. So my dad's ancestors, for example, my last name comes from the Canary Islands, and they met in Louisiana, people from the Senegambia region of West Africa, and people from France, and people from other parts of Spain, and that's how I got here, right? That's how I got the name Morale. It previously had an S on it, and in some way lost that S. And so my dad's family had been living in that same bayou region for 200 years. And we were the kind of first family to move out of Louisiana, and I've lived in other parts of the United States as well. So Demond's suits, of course, are sculptural forms made for his body. So part of what he does is wear those masks that he creates. So it's quite a performance art as well as a visual art. I think one of the things that Demond is doing is really pioneering and refining the technique of black masking and putting as much effort into the work that he creates as visual art as well as the performing art side of it. And one of the things I love about the conversation we had at the museum in our Atlantic Worlds Gallery between his suit and the film that plays called All on Mardi Gras Day, which is this film of Demond wearing one of his suits for a parade, and he really talks about how the tradition actually saved his life and gave him black men in particular to look up to, and these men who are creating this craft work, but also this fine art, right? Just the sheer portraiture of it all is amazing to me. You can also, in this exhibition in particular, see the evolution of his work and look at some of his older pieces, and of course some of his contemporary work that again looks at contemporary figures, but you can also see some of the motifs. Lots of weapons. I think even if you don't recognize the faces you're looking at, you recognize the energy behind it. You'll also see a lot of water. We talk about water a lot at the International African American Museum because water is, of course, how many of our ancestors got to what became the United States, and many of them kind of in their home going when their spirit went home, they thought the water would carry them back home. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of context. I won't tell you all about Louisiana. I could be here for hours, but...
So could you just describe for people that aren't familiar with the suits themselves, because we're looking at like deconstructed suits, and then there's kind of this mini-me suit, a full suit behind us. So that's what it looks when you're wearing this suit. And that's an apron. Is that one an apron too?
Yes, I believe these are both aprons of different sizes, and then so it's made of many components. So a full suit would be like what we have in our gallery, much larger than this, but representing different pieces. In fact, the Job Defender suit in particular has 3 layers of sleeves, and each sleeve has another person's face on it, and so both sides. In addition to the portraiture that's on the apron, we of course have the boots, and all of this. Again, if you see the film, it's also on YouTube. You can see him sweating and pouring. It's pouring off of him, and they bring him to the parade in a U-Haul. So this, the massiveness of the suit. He even recently talked about the cost of the plumes, for example, and how much it costs to make a suit, upwards of $100,000 in supplies, not including, of course, the labor and energy, and then, of course, all the research he does to really portray these historical figures as accurately as possible through this visual art. So
part of black masking culture has to do with being a cultural bearer, right? That's the term they all are using. So do only black men participate in black masking culture in New Orleans? And is it only a Mardi Gras celebration thing?
So it is not only Mardi Gras. Black masking is, there's a season for it, and parades are often secret. And so, of course, they're outside of Mardi Gras, which, of course, are announced parades that would be in the newspapers and on the news. It's predominantly male, right? So those who are becoming chiefs in the community are men, but they're of course supported by their women. So Demond will talk about his wife and the work that she helps him do, and his team in sewing this, as he does not do it all by himself. Like, there's so many pieces at this point that he's creating. He's also creating it as works of art, right? So for galleries and museums like this one. So.
And then a final question to ask you. So you've referenced a few times the Jaw Defender suit. So the first word is J-A-H. So maybe you can tell us what that is. And then it's a suit. I don't know how many of you have been to the International African American Museum here downtown on the peninsula, but it's this enormous yellow plumed suit. I mean, it's just massive and beautiful and arresting with all of its colors and so forth. and it's in the middle of a room with a lot of other things going on. And so I'm wondering if you could just like describe the suit a little, tell us what Ja means, and then describe why it's in that particular room.
Yes, so Ja is actually my son's middle name. So Ja means the highest. It's actually a biblical term, and in Ja Defender, you see exactly that, the highest defenders. So you'll see Haile Selassie as kind of the main figure and central figure in the piece, and then there's many other revolutionaries, both male and female, portrayed in the suit. And again, you'll see these motifs around you as well of them holding weapons and carrying weapons. And so when you look at the suit, even if you don't recognize the figures, you again see the motifs and kind of get an understanding of the suit and his intentions behind these pieces, which again are oftentimes representing these revolutionary figures in African American and African diasporic history.
Is there a piece in this any means or necessary exhibition that you particularly like and you'd want to just take us through a little bit?
So what was particularly interesting to me, well, you might have saw on the Instagram for the Halsey, us looking at this suit, me and my associate curator, it's the back of us because we are at this apron, because we're like looking at it. It's one of his earlier works, and you can see kind of the evolution, not only in his technique, but in the types of materials he uses. It's in 2017 where he really starts to practice this as a contemporary art technique and really starts to refine his work and spend, more on these more intricate beads and using less of the rhinestones that had been used historically because they were, of course, more affordable. And one of the things, of course, that is important to the work is financing the artist, right? Paying him enough to be able to create these works, which are quite expensive. We have plumes on the side in case something happens to our suits, but we're cherishing those 3 plumes because we know how much they cost. But in this show in particular, the masks for me I was trying to get those for our museum on loan. I was like, for Mardi Gras, for the month of February, and also Black History Month. I just thought they were so unique. And again, in our gallery, we're talking about the Atlantic world and the African diaspora more largely. So of course the story of Mardi Gras fits into that narrative. We talk about Carnival, we talk about some of the other traditions in other parts of the diaspora that reflect these same images and culture, these same culture bearers.
So now I'm going to put Dr. Johnson in the hot seat. It seems like a good moment to follow up also because I have some questions to ask you about the term that you've used, which is visual rhetoric, storytelling, and so forth. But I think it's also a good time to talk a little bit about how he makes all this stuff. So they're glass beads, right? Little tiny glass beads and a needle and thread. And I think he said he has something like 5,000 pounds of beads at his studio in New Orleans. So that's a lot. And I mean, you can see that it's very minute work. And I know at a talk that he gave here at the Halsey a couple weeks ago, he talked with a lot of pride about the fact that he does not fill space on his canvases with a lot of rhinestones and big beads. It's all these tiny beads. And so just listening to that, it made me think a lot about Black masculinity and masculinity, I suppose, more as a theme generally. And that seems to be your jam, and so I thought I'd ask you a little bit about it. So this sort of intricate, tiny work interests me, because both that and the fact that sewing isn't something you traditionally associate with masculinity. And so that's a big part of how he produces these. He said it takes something like 4,000 hours to produce, I think, one of these larger aprons, but that's a pretty big time commitment. And so he does all this tiny work. He talked also about how he's had to start getting glasses and different prescriptions and do some, I think, acupuncture and things like that to deal with the bodily labor of it. And then, so there's all this hunched over tiny work, and then there's the performance itself, which is this huge, sweaty, you're wearing 150 pounds. It's kind of like a CrossFit style experience of performance during a very large public ceremony. And so I'm just interested in how you think about that and think about this art and the stories that it's telling, kind of those two sides of it, the making of it, the performing of it, and then what it's telling in terms of your interest in Black masculinity.
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out where I start. So I think in terms of just thinking about black masculinity construction, particularly in the United States, um, when we think about black men, we're thinking about black men being constructed, right? Where there are these societal powers and ideas that construct who black men can be, where they can go, what they can do, right? What they have access to. And along with that is also the sort of hypervisibility of black masculinity in America, right? And so when we think about the sort of hypervisibility of black men and, you know, the sort of emphasized nature of the suits, right? I think it makes a lot of sense. In nature, we see lots of male animals. Lions have manes, peacocks, right? The plumage is very intentional, right? So it kind of makes a sense that black men would gravitate toward this, if that makes sense. But then, like you said, there's also that juxtaposition with this art of sewing. It's delicate. It takes time. It is domestic in a lot of ways, right? We call these aprons. So we immediately think about the sort of language of domesticity there. And so when I think about Demond's work, and we've kind of had conversations about this, I'm thinking about the story and the rhetoric that he's giving, not simply about these historical figures, but how is he speaking back against this idea of what black masculinity is constructed in the United States, right? And I think that because this culture and New Orleans as a city is so syncretic and it encompasses a lot of different things, that the black masculine Indians are sort of elusive in how they understand black masculinity and probably how people kind of interpret that, because it doesn't look like a very traditionalized sort of black masculinity, right? In how it is created or how it is performed. But I also think that we have to think about the idea of the competition, right? How black masculine Indians, and I think that Demond reiterates this a lot. He gets a lot of questions. I know my students had questions about, you know, the sort of challenges, right? Where he says like, they don't want to challenge us. A lot of students, and I think that people in general, when they think about black masculinity, they do think about violence. They do think about that sort of bravado, but their challenges are who's the prettiest, right? Whose beadwork is the best? And Demond is like, somebody asked like, what happens if you make a mistake? And he's like, I don't make mistakes, right? Because he understands that a crinkle in a bead or using the wrong materials is a way for him to essentially lose, right? And so when we think about that idea, how are we radically kind of rescripting what black masculinity looks like through this black masculine process? And that is kind of a lot of what I study, how black men's memoirs and their sort of self-writing is writing themselves out of things and writing themselves into things. How are they defining themselves for themselves? And I think that black masking is a way to kind of redefine it. And I think it, you know, New Orleans as a city kind of sticks out by itself in terms of the American landscape. But I also think that its practice sticks out in terms of black masculine construction in America. So I hope that kind of gets me to where you were going, but then also thinking about this idea of rhetoric, right? The art of effective communication and this storytelling. What is the story that he's trying to tell? He talks a lot about, you know, the sort of Native American portion of this culture and how he is intentional about not making them red and using red beads, right? He's kind of doing this retelling of history from a very particular lens that is not only important for just New Orleans culture, but it is important for American culture to kind of retell this history in a more accurate way.
And if I could just add to that, you know, just thinking about, again, these aprons and the domestic side of things. I grew up where my dad cooked, my grandfather cooked. When my grandmother died, we was still gonna eat. So he was gonna be in front of the stove. And so it's so strange to me when I hear my associate curator was saying that some women were saying their husbands won't eat if they're not home. And I was like, we was gonna eat. No matter what. So this idea of men in the kitchen, and again, it wasn't strange to me for those 2 weeks of vacation to eat every day when my dad was home. So
Yeah, and when you think about like how Demond is like, I'm sewing all the time, right? That his occupation is this thing that is so historically feminine, so traditionally feminine, right? But that he is retelling these stories through this lens. For me, it gives me a lot of hope in terms of my study of black masculinity and how I teach it, because like that sort of embracing of the feminine, right? Particularly for black men, we can have these sort of newer visions of art, of history, of culture, right? So yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful set of images here, right? I look back at the Ashanti masks; those are some of my favorites as well. And just thinking about like the idea of the trickster figure, right? They look like they are having some sort of conversation with you, even though they're not saying anything. If you kind of sit there and look at them long enough, like one of them is going to grab your attention, and you're starting to have this conversation, which makes sense because Demond is always talking about like pushing back against like the gallery, right? The idea of the gallery, which to me is a sort of canon conversation, right? How is he pushing back against what the canon of the gallery is? So I think there are lots of things that he's doing here rhetorically and also in terms of like narrative storytelling with these pictures.
And could you also just briefly contextualize a little bit, because you've referred to it a few times, his integration of Native Americans into his iconography. Um, and he also calls them First Nation peoples, which was a new term for me. If you want to just elaborate on that at all, what's going on there?
Now, I don't want to sound like I'm an expert because I'm not. But I think he's talking to or talking about the people who were here, right? And we kind of talk about that in Charleston as well, right? That there were enslaved Africans here, but there were also native populations here, right? And in the book that we're teaching Mardi Gras Indians, Nikisha Williams is having this conversation about there not necessarily being a sort of pinpointing of the origin of black masking Indians, right? But that it depends on who you are, where you're from, the sort of cultural lens you have. And so he's honoring that very intentional portion of this black masking culture by highlighting the native peoples, right? But then Nikisha Williams is also talking about the influence of the Catholic Church and also how America is a part of this conversation. And Demond is very intentional about black masking being different than other sort of visual diasporic images that we see of Carnival, right? He specifically points out the fact that they glue things and we don't glue things in black masking. We sew. But I think that it is, a part of that sort of conversation where he's honoring people who were there, right? And again, that is a part of the sort of retelling of history and in being inclusive of those people who were there, who they learned from, who, they made it with, and all of those kind of cultural, genealogical ideas, yeah.
Martina, Seminole culture part of your ancestry? I think, because Demond also talks about, something specific to New Orleans and to the Bayou in southern Louisiana in general is that I think he said that when enslaved black people were freed, some of the Seminole communities and stuff took them in, and it became, and they were on reservations, but it became a sort of like halfway house on the way to figuring out what to do next.
Yeah, so I have found indigenous people in my genealogy, and that is, again, the isolation of the bayous and this French and Spanish rule in Louisiana meant that there was opportunities for, first of all, emancipation. So some of those enslaved people from the Senegambia region were eventually freed and were free people of color, and they oftentimes mated with indigenous people, in particular, for my genealogy, Atacapa people living in Point Coupee, Louisiana. And so I was able to trace that. There was a blog all about this kind of mixing of these cultures, and there was paperwork in French that was translated, and people inheriting land and all of this rich culture that happened between all of these different people from different parts of the world, just right there on that bayou.
So Martina, and I'm going to ask you a few questions now, David. Martina's talked a bit about the isolation of the bayou, and we keep bringing up water, and I have to say that was kind of a revelation to me, but of course there's water represented in all the aprons that we see, and that seems like something that's very interesting to you and very intimately related to your interest in environmental concerns and so forth. And so I just wanted to ask you a little bit about about your work generally, and then how you're integrating it and seeing it expanded and represented and reflected and stuff in this exhibition that we're surrounded by. And so first, let's go back to a definition, because we've brought this word up lots of times, and I think it's an important one to talk about. So tell us what the word diaspora means, diasporic. What is that?
Okay, so thank you so much. So the word diaspora comes from Greek originally, and it literally means across, scatter, so to scatter across. And the word diaspora is used often to talk about any group of people that have migrated for any reason, you know, whether willingly or not, across various areas, usually around the world. So that is where the term diaspora comes from. Most often it was used to talk about the Jewish diaspora initially, and others wanting to make these connections that we are all talking about here sort of brought forth this term, African diaspora. And then, you know, just kind of very humbly kind of coming in personally, I'm also part of a diaspora, very different context, very different time. But my parents are Romanian immigrants that, you know, escaped communist regime in the 80s. So there are so many diasporas, and there's many ways that these communities have come together. And as we've, you know, Martina said, and we've talked about, New Orleans in particular and Louisiana was really a space for different groups to come together in different contexts.
So maybe we can just talk about that a little bit more. So your specialty regions are Latin America and the Caribbean. So what is, when we talk about diaspora there, like what are we talking about? And does it have any similarities to the New Orleans, you know, the diaspora that we talk about when we talk about New Orleans culture?
Yeah, so there's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of differences, but in many ways here, Melancon's work, and when he was speaking in the artist talk, he really spoke to that, and you can see that as you go around the different aspects going back, like the deep roots going back to Africa, that you can see in different ways in different areas. And I think when I was envisioning my course in particular, I was thinking about communities that are on the coast and have used the coast to survive, and have used it as spaces of freedom against the odds, right? And sort of having, so that's kind of the connections that I see, and we see that here in his work, yeah.
But of course, when you talk about that history, the water as a symbol and as a means of transportation is really fraught. Do you see any of the like tension of that when you look around this room, or how do you understand? So, you know, there's like literal implications of water, like living on, you know, during periods of climate change. Obviously, it's dangerous to live in water. But let's talk first on the symbolic and then move to the literal. That's more my style.
So I would say that symbolically the water is very fraught in the sense that for a long time, and still in many ways, water is used as a method of commerce, a method of transportation, and we're talking here about migration, but as we've mentioned, the migration of many of the ancestors from New Orleans was a forced migration under enslavement. And so water eventually becomes a space of freedom because these communities resisted that enslavement and fought for their freedom and found those spaces, whether, as we see here, through the help of the First Nations or on their own fighting for it. So the water becomes both the means of arrival as well as that space, and I think we see that most strongly in the bras coupés apron there, where Melancon talked about this figure, bras coupés, who fought and died to be free. And in his explanation, he put the railroad on that image, and that for him represents the Underground Railroad. And so you see that theme in his imagery.
It's also kind of interesting because the railway itself kind of looks like water. I mean, it almost looks like a river. I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't know the exact story of Bras Coupé, but it was a new story for me and a very sort of Louisiana story. So first, just to ask Martina, is the story of Bras Coupé a story that's like a common element of African American history that's like known?
I wouldn't say it's widely known. We didn't really talk much about history in my family. I think back and realize, like my grandparents only spoke French, and the fact that none of us speak French just speaks to, this kind of lack of really thinking about, passing that culture down, right? I'm gonna challenge my dad tomorrow to say something to me in French. But I remember him singing to me in French when I was a child. And so I just, I'm learning a lot more about Louisiana as a historian and a museum person than I did as a Louisianian. So it's just kind of interesting to me. Like I didn't even, think about my ancestors being part of a large, revolt of enslaved people in Point Coupé and all of the things, I never expected to find out where my last name came from. And so I'm learning so much kind of after the fact while I'm here in Charleston, so.
And so, David, I guess it's interesting because you also have a personal connection that you highlighted to diaspora. And so I'm wondering, as you look at art like this and understand sort of making something beautiful and creating and integrating exchanges between different peoples and so forth, how it inflects your understanding of sort of a broader message in general about how we deal with difficult histories and like the power of art and all of that?
Yes, and I think again here I would defer to Melancon's words when he talked about love, dedication. In the documentary, the word he uses is discipline. This is what really draws him to it. Community, resistance, resilience, survival. But I think we just really see that not just in the power of his imagery, but when we talk about the intensity of his work, that for decades he has not stopped sewing, and he's just continually doing it, that these are tens of thousands of beads that take thousands of hours. And on top of that, he's doing work with the community, getting grants to help the community, teaching others how to do this. It's a dedication of love. And again, these are not my words, these are his words. So, I'd say go look up his videos and hear him speak, and look at this art. Just sit with it and look at it, and you'll see that.
And so the documentary you're referencing, is that available on it's on his website, isn't it? There's a link to it. There was a documentary made about him.
Yeah, I believe it's on his website, and it's also, if you search his name on YouTube, it'll come up.
Do you think about, and I know he spoke of this a little bit, I mean, he was doing beading when Katrina hit, isn't that right? And so he said he had to do it like with no power on and all sorts of really extreme circumstances. I don't have a really pointed question to ask about that, but I just think it's sort of interesting, and I wonder, because you're interested in environment and climate, if you think about how the sort of working conditions of the artist, factor in, and the place that he's working in a sort of place that's perpetually, like us, in danger of yearly natural disaster, how that kind of inflects the way you look at all this.
So I wanted to jump in there. He talks about his process as one where he sews at eye level, so he never even sees the middle until he's done, right? But he also told this story about how sewing got him kicked out of his house. And so when we are talking about the sort of economic idea, right, when we're talking about the the natural sort of environment that he's in. We have to remember, like, the Ninth Ward, right? What that means in American history, because I think it means a great deal when we understand American history. And just how, even when you go back to the Ninth Ward now, there's still so much damage that has just simply been forgotten about, right? And there are people that may not be as commercially successful as Demond is as an artist, who do the same sorts of preparation, right? And so even though Demond may not be in that space anymore, there are people that are still putting out these things with this labor of love in the damnedest of environments, right? And so I think that it makes a lot of sense that he's writing about resistance, and he's writing about revolution, or he's talking about it in his work, and kind of literally sewing it into the fabric of not only the city, right, but also engendering other people through grants, through, talks and other sorts of community service. He's sewing this idea of resistance into the city. And as he's talking about the sort of economics of it, he talks about having these battles with the city who wants to use them to highlight New Orleans culture, but not pay them what they're worth or give them the space, right? And so embedded in that, just like embedded in any sort of African communities and any sort of immigrant communities in America, there's inherently this idea of resistance. And it's not simply just like a historical thing, but it's also an economic resistance, it's an environmental resistance, right? All of these sort of resistances that are happening.
So interesting. I bet that interests you, John, as a political scientist.
I was trying to get him to talk. That's why I was like,
there we go.
economically.
It was a really good transition to John.
I'm just listening, just listening.
But I mean, up until, Martina, David, Kenny, and I all work on like literature, art, these forms, right, cultural forms. And John Thomas's wheelhouse is a little bit different. And you're interested in legacies of Black resistance, imperialism, indigeneity. So I would say the material that you probably normally look at isn't necessarily, the first thing might not be art. Whatever political scientists base their research on is usually probably not like analyzing paintings or beadwork and that sort of thing.
Lauren, I would stop you right there and say I respectfully would disagree with you on that totally. Culture, one of the first things I learned in grad school is that politics is culture and all culture is politics. And so when I was doing my research on Black movements in Peru and Ecuador, we looked at the songs, we looked at the art, we looked at the ways that the products of these movements, and I think it's a disservice to my discipline where people say, where are the numbers, where's the power? No, the power, the numbers, the resistance is in everything, and I was just thinking when I walked in, you have, I hold 5 affiliations on this campus: Women's and Gender Studies, African American Studies, the Carolina Low Country, the Atlantic World, the Hispanic Studies, that's my Malaysian affiliation, and I'm forgetting one somewhere around here, Latin American Caribbean Studies. Listen, I would go forget. Well, the point is, all those spaces, some of them located in the schools that aren't social sciences, are integral to my research and who I am, because I can't look at or explain a political issue without talking to you about the culture where it comes around. For example, David and I were talking today about Congo Square. So yesterday in class, we were going over Introduction to World Politics, talking about mercantilism. And as part of the class that Dr. Do I call you Kenny or Dr. Johnson? I don't know. Kenny and I share. They're getting from him the linguistic side, but when they come to my class and I'm talking to them about mercantilism and empires, I can't explain mercantilism to you without helping you to see what mercantilism meant to New Orleans, what Congo Square meant to politics. Those things to me are all linked. So I can't talk about politics without talking about culture. And again, I think one of the problems that my discipline has been that people say, well, this is something new. No, it's not new. It's embedded in us. So I would say that this is as much as part of my work as anything else, which is why you have a political scientist and an English professor and, and a Hispanic literary scholar here together, all seamlessly collaborating.
Okay, I guess you've successfully defended your point that political science is a vast tapestry of interpretive work. So maybe I'll press you on that a little bit. So look around the room at something that all of us can see together here, and could you read into it a little bit for you? Is there a piece in here that that moves you, that tells you some of those stories of, you were talking about mercantilism, imperialism, resistance, like what do you see?
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, Lauren. And again, we were talking about the Congo Square piece. When you go to the next room, when you look at the workshop, and you look at Haile Selassie, who is an icon to African resistance. And then from the political science perspective, when I talk to my students about international law, the failure of the League of Nations, one of the League of Nations' biggest failures was when Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Haile Selassie went and defended his country. And in fact, on the apron that you see, Jah Defender, there is a reason why Haile Selassie is on that apron, because he was looked at universally as an icon of black resistance. And when I look through this room, Kenny talked about the Ashanti masks down there, and going up this place, looking at, now mind you, you got a Elton John, you got a Stevie Wonder, you have a Cicely Tyson. Mind you, these different persons in some way or another are icons of resistance. I mean, you can't talk about LGBTQ liberation without talking about Elton John. Look at Cicely Tyson, one of our major black female activists who broke barriers. I mean, Stevie Wonder, come on, Stevie Wonder. And over in our corner, we have Fela Kuti. Again, Fela Kuti wasn't just an artist. He was an activist against the dictatorship in Nigeria. That's one of the reasons why his studio got raided repeatedly. So when I come to this space, I've encouraged my students to look at the political meanings behind these spaces. But for my class that I'm working with Kenny in particular, because it's a 30,000 feet view of world politics, we're digging into colonialism, imperialism, and the economics of this. We're going to have the students looking at a documentary on the whole beading business. Thanks to College of Charleston's librarians, who shout out to the librarians, they found a great documentary on the beading of Mardi Gras. And so when we're talking about international political economy, we're going to look at, where do these beads come from? How are they made? Like, Demond is very particular about the beads he gets. He was talked about the Czech Republic beads, but sadly some aren't as interested in that. So we're trying to incorporate these different bits and pieces into the way the students look at the politics and bring them back to this place. So I see politics all throughout this space when I'm here. And as someone who has visited the Lower Ninth Ward many times, not during Carnival, as someone who had friends who had to move out during Katrina and couldn't make it back home, this to me is as much political as you can get. It's as political to me as, us talking about the elections coming up in November.
So could you interpret for us how you understand the title of this exhibit, As Any Means Are Necessary? Is that a political message to you?
Almost definitely. I mean, I think it's a play on Malcolm X's famous words. And back to your point about culture. Culture is resistance. So his means are these beads, telling the stories, and Demond has talked about the importance of reinterpreting history. This man has probably a better grasp of African American history and black diasporic history than some people whose books I've assigned my students to read, because he understands it in his world and in his life. So any means is by picking up a needle and thread to show you what my culture is. It's that lived culture and experience. But you have some good questions. Can we get to the questions you gave me? Because I want to talk about those too.
Yeah, of course. Sure, John. Here we go. Well, I asked you two questions. So one is about Carnival and Mardi Gras, and one is about Peau Noir, Masque Blanc. I don't know if we have time for both. Do you have a preference?
Real quick, Carnival and Mardi Gras, because I wanted to address that.
So let me just ask the question. So you're an expert on Brazil, where there's a strong culture of Carnival, like New Orleanian Mardi Gras. Have you ever been? Could you explain what the celebration is and give us a sense of the role that masking and costumes play?
Cool. So I just wanted to briefly touch on that. So I have not been to Carnival in Rio, but I wanted to dispel and like unpack what you gave and look at Carnival taking a step back. So Carnival is something, we know the religious connotations. You'd have the carnival before Fat Tuesday. So we understand a few things here. We're understanding this celebration that for a brief period overturned the power tables between the enslaved Africans and whites in the city, overturned the social order. And you see this throughout the region. So one of the things that I wanted to look at is Carnival, and this is someone's dissertation somewhere, I'm positive, in a diasporic sense. Carnival in the Caribbean, Carnival in Brazil and New Orleans. You see some similar patterns. And also this commercialization of Carnival and the fact that we understand that some people look at, oh, Carnival is great, Mardi Gras is great, I'm going to go down and get drunk. But for the people who make these outfits every year, this is a religious experience in and of itself. So I want people to understand that while I haven't been to Mardi Gras, I have been to Kadooman in Barbados, which is our carnival experience, but it happens after the crop over, the cane has been cut in Barbados. And you see similar persons making intricate costumes all around. And so this intricacy of making the costumes is something that is, whether you go to a carnival in Barbados or Grenada or St. Kitts or wherever, you see these things. But also the social order inverting and what that means and who's making money off of it. In Brazil, you have two principal carnivals. You have the Rio Carnival and the Salvador Carnival in Bahia. To be honest, I prefer the Salvador Carnival because you feel more of the Afrocentric roots in Bahia than you do in Rio. Rio is wonderful, it's great, and there's some wonderful, great, it's beautiful, but the carnival in Salvador is different. You have the same processions, the same drums, but it's different, and that's the one that I prefer. And I wanted to close with, there's a song by a great Brazilian singer, Alcione, who talks about Carnival in Rio, and it's called Dia de Graça, or Day of Thanks, and it looks at what happens after Carnival. She says, black people embrace the day that you were a king, but remember how we need to act afterwards. And so it's encouraging people, all this time and grandeur, splendor we've had on this high point, we have to remember, how do we live out the rest of our lives? Because Carnival is only a day or two, but what do we do for the rest of the year? So Carnival, to me, and Mardi Gras, they're wonderful cultural experiences, but there's some polemical challenges with who makes the money, what happens to the communities, and what happens afterwards in wherever you have a carnival.
Do you want me to ask you any other questions? I'm just kidding. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. I wanted to make sure that we leave a few minutes for audience questions at the end, but before we get to that, I would just like to thank our four superb and very passionate panelists for a really fascinating talk. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes. I'm wondering if anyone seeks a clarification or has anything that they would like to ask our panelists while we're here. Students especially are encouraged to participate. Dr. Long will pass you the mic. Here we go.
Hi, my question is, do women have any role in the crafting process of the masks and the full outfits? And also, sort of related but a little off, what role, if any, do queer and trans people play in this tradition? Also wanted to say that what you were saying about all the effort and how much people have to exert themselves during the performance, it reminded me a lot of drag. So I don't know if that's an appropriate line to draw, but that's what it made me think of. So what are your thoughts on that?
Great questions.
Yeah, so to answer the aspect of women's role, so Demond, when he was in here, he said that I feel his wife's name should be on next to his on here because he said that she has touched every single piece and has done the work with him the entire time. And actually, on this side in the bras coupé, she fully beaded everything on the left. So those three pieces, that's completely her work.
The vest is her, right, and the apron is
Yes.
beaded, yeah.
Yes.
Alicia.
And so she completely is part of everything he does, as well as that piece is hers. And then the other thing that I know from what I've assigned to my students and we've discussed in class, and maybe you all can jump in if you want to as well, is that there are queens as well, and there are women that are part of the Black masculine culture as well. Even though it is predominantly men, there are women who are part of it as well and have leadership roles or are working together with the men in what they do.
Yeah, I think when you look at the history of Black resistance globally, but especially in the United States, right, a lot of the sort of visual elements that you will see the men, right? So you'll see the men in plumage, you'll see them challenging one another. You might see images of the men of the Black Panthers without realizing that the Black Panthers as an organization was majority women, right? So as we are thinking about this, you see Demond, but you have to say his wife's name, right, and give her space, because as much as he is culture bearer, she's holding that too, right? And I'm pretty sure that if we started to interview Black masculine Indian chiefs, there's a woman behind all of it, right? So politically in America, particularly in the Black community, we cannot go anywhere without thinking about the role that women play, and it's not an insignificant role.
And I think you're spot on when you mentioned drag and performance. I mean, David's being a little modest up here, but he teaches a wonderful course looking at those types of issues. And I think Carnival and this type of experience we have allows a certain permissiveness for certain roles. It's probably the only time where you can see, you know, a masculine person performing femininity and likewise. So I think you're spot on about the performance element. And again, Dr. Dulceany is quite an expert on that, so you should ask him about it some more.
Thank you. I would compare it to the ballroom culture, and it, especially because it has, I think I see two things. One is that it's that same aspect of battling with beauty. So you battle through dances, you battle through technique, you battle through care and attention, through, you know, looking a certain way, and it is about beauty. Actually, going back to Spanish, that's where the house of la bella comes from, because that is like saying belleza or belleza in Spanish. So beauty and femininity as a form of battling, you can see that in the core of drag culture, which is at its core a Black culture as well.
And I mean, just the idea of masks as something that is protective of what's behind it as well, right? Obviously, we think about like Paula and Dunbar, right? This idea of the mask as something that conceals, right? It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes, right? I think that that's a part of this sort of resistance as well. And when we think about Black art, particularly when we're thinking about going into the Harlem Renaissance, right? This idea of things being propaganda, all art being propaganda, right? You taking this thing that you see for face value without really understanding intersubjectively the context behind it, right? It is an economical idea, it is a political idea, right? But that mask is something that shields the outside from perhaps having the opportunity to know intersubjectively what's happening behind it.
Kenny got our second question, so I'm glad he hit that second question.
Thank you for a fabulous question. I think we need to wrap up for today because it's 5 o'clock. If you have additional questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, I'm going to just make a moderator decision that they could probably answer those for you individually if they want to stay a couple minutes. Thank you so much to our audience for coming. Thank you to our panelists. It's been a really wonderful program. I've learned a lot.
And thank you, Lauren, for putting this together and doing a wonderful job.